just try to like do a shorter meeting, and if there's stuff left out, we can do next week. But since we don't have a very tight schedule anyway, I think that, keeping it short makes the video more watchable for others anyway. People who didn't come don't miss out on that much anyway. And I mean, there's no schedule, so we can just pick it up next week. So my suggestion is perhaps we should try to go all the way to like take over 1 hour and a half. So here is like until 9 p.m. Brazilian time, and then we can pick it up next week, just so it's not ridiculously late, See if it gets in the way or if it works. So you guys can see the screen, right? Yeah, so my idea is just to explain what this is, like, I already spoke to Renzo and to Raquel about this, Yasha, but I feel like we've had a couple of kind of segments in our research thus far. Like, there was this very loose attempt. We tried out a bunch of stuff in the beginning, and it kind of condensed or got kind of funneled to a point where the meetings were very kind of cohesive and connected. We presented the primer. It had matters concerning resolution, for example, and then we presented on Natal that had to do with that. Caron presented on Mark Wilson dealing with a similar topic. Like, we arrived at a place where things were really connected. Then I think we entered into a second phase more recently where we said, okay, this is kind of minimally structured, but what else, right? Where are we heading? And we tried out a bunch of stuff. We spoke about a lot of different topics. So if anyone sees our last couple of meetings, they're more unstructured, not really presentations on specific things. You guys gave the last presentation, in fact, like more structured, which was the one on behavioral meteorology. So what I tried to do, because I had a bit of free time, was to go over pretty much the texts that were mentioned in the meetings, or things that are kind of nearby. Things that we mentioned, perhaps we didn't find bibliography on it, but I just tried to kind of bring together this constellation of topics and try to organize them a bit and see if there isn't kind of a direction inside of that, some orientation that is already starting to appear on the one hand, and on the other to see if technically those kind of ideas aren't kind of connected anyway, right? To look inside the papers and see, okay, but even if I can't really understand them, I would have to study more. Still, you can see that they're leaning on similar techniques and formalisms and things like that. So my idea was to organize a bit some papers and try to kind of frame them in the context of the stuff we did and kind of next steps we know we want to take, and see if they fit, if they don't fit. So my idea is not to go into detail into any of the stuff, was just to kind of suggest that possibly by focusing on those papers and those ideas, they might actually give a good idea of what to study, what to present in more detail, to make the discussions more concrete and possibly kind of take us into a next kind of sequence of meetings that again covers stuff that is more compatible and that's in dialogue and that actually builds and accumulates, right? So I divided it. The idea is to cover, again, I'm not sure if we're going to cover everything today, but my idea was to first just give an overview of what I think we already did. But rather than using, for example, as I did a couple of times ago when we were writing the primer, we were always kind of comparing it to Marx Capital, and seeing if we covered what Marx covered and so on. But for the political organization stuff and to make the bridge between political economy and political organization, I think the Badiou's book is still the best one to see these correlations and see if we have kind of meat to put in that skeleton that brings it closer to the stuff we want to do. So my idea is to very quickly just go over that and then add these 4 themes, 4 kind of research directions that I think are quite connected. And in one way or another, they kind of start answering or given a path to answer some of the kind of strategic steps we said might be interesting to cover. And at least for me, even though the technical part might not be very convincing in the sense that I'm not sure if it's the path, the questions that I think that they would be answering are very convincing. So just to begin then, just to give kind of a map of how I understand the stuff that we already covered, right? These are the chapters or the big kind of books, right, inside Logics of Worlds. And if you look at the previous work we did, I'm considering here mostly from the standpoint of what Dennis and I worked on, but I think it covers more than that. We could say that the text, the primer on political phenomenology, it pretty much covers this part of being an event and only a part of this discussion on change here, right? But it's still a bit bigger than Marx Capital. As we always discussed, it's not meant to be a description of Marx. It tries to reconstruct Marxian categories in a larger frame. So there is a difference between the stuff that fits in the primer and the stuff that fits in Capital. And even in that sense, we only really did this for the first volume, right? So with this in mind, it seems like there are three big projects or big lanes of research that are open right now. So I think the first one is just, that's why I put it here. See if this is working. Yeah, I put it here because it covers more than stuff that comes from, for example, from Marx or from Capital, right? It concerns all the stuff that is framing the political analysis from Capital, for example. So stuff that we don't know yet, that we touched upon, but we don't know how to refine. Like how to explain this multi-layered logic, right? Currently, we have this idea that objects in a capitalist social formation, they're actually kind of informed by these three transcendentals, right? Or transcendental layers. And that they connect in more than one way. But what are these arrows and what is the kind of logic of going between logics? It's something we don't have a lot of clarity, I think, about, right? Then there is the question of the other transcendental layer. So the layer of reciprocity and contract, which is stuff that we didn't really develop that much. It's being kind of discussed in parallel to our meetings. Tiago, Raquel, John, and I, we're talking about Levi-Strauss and this sort of formal approach we have. John is working on this angle on contracts and state and seeing if it also fits, but it's still kind of, again, it's a further examination. It's like enriching and moving further in things that were already contained in the primer, and are not part of Capital, but were not fully developed in that text, right? And then there's this last point here, which is something I think we already started as well, which I think is something that's, for me, it was quite clear from Yasha's presentation with Dennis, that is also a lane that fits in this part. It doesn't fit in the, let's say, it's not so much about what the next steps, but it's actually a way of redescribing the stuff we already did, which is to go into that behavioral meteorology stuff and stop treating these objects here, kind of in between these different layers, stop treating this object as a static thing and actually treating it as a sort of constraints on possible actions, right? Which is what the meteorology text kind of gives a hint of how to do. So I would say all these things are parts of one of the lanes of research we could be doing, that is exploring this space here. Most of the stuff that fits here is kind of underway with the primer, so the basic categories of volume 1. And these other points deal with what's around that. So states, communities, how to move amongst them, between them, how to redescribe all of these things in a more normative way, like constraints and so on, which I think it's pretty much like this last point here is about the redescribing things in terms of power, I think, right? If you treat social constraints as a sort of power structure, right? What you can and cannot do. It would be, let's say, the power analysis that goes along with this. Then there's the second kind of lane of research, which is one that I don't think we spend much time on, but I know Dennis is starting to look into it. He's going to present on the theory of firms. I know Raquel is interested on these discussions on contemporary platforms and things like this, but there's a lot of concepts that I think don't fit our presentation of volume 1 of Capital because they're more contemporary descriptions of things. And it would be a separate lane of research to see, okay, considering the political economical analysis we did, how do we enrich it to discuss more contemporary phenomena, contemporary forms of capitalism? After all, that's kind of one of the big tests people are going to put this project to. How does it help with current kind of description of the world, right? So I just added a bunch of these sort of things. But the stuff that I wanted to bring to light today and discuss a bit concerns this thing here, which is how to expand from the primer to the rest of the points of the book that we didn't cover yet, right? So taking this logics of world as a skeleton. So we know that in Badiou's theory, like this is a kind of separate, or more like a, this almost fits here, right? It's a description of forms of subjectivity and so on. But here you have the theory of change, and then radical change, which includes a theory of like sites, situation where radical change can happen. How do you decide and how do you decide and build on these sites and investigate novelty? And how do you compose and build up from these local investigations into a body or larger structure, right? And those are the things that we didn't cover yet. So I just kind of framed this into a couple of points as well, though we could definitely add others. So what does it mean to find novelty in a multi-layered world? Because, for example, it can mean that inside the workplace, a communitarian constraint appears. So, for example, everyone goes vegan in a company. That's a novelty. But because we have many layers, we can make the distinction between novelty that was nowhere and novelty that was in a layer that didn't count in that object, and now it counts more. It constrains that object more. So we can make distinctions there that I don't think are very well established. So we could go there. Another thing is to talk about how do you move from the sort of material dimension of site-specific novelty. How does that material get entangled into a new way of doing stuff? How are we going to account for that in political terms? Right. How do we bring agent, strategy, and tactics into the picture as well? And then how do we talk about like local organizations or local political processes combining into something larger, right? So they're all questions that concern political organization in this very broad sense. I think that there are many other questions we could add here. I just wanted to put some just to show that it's not really covering, those are questions not covered by any of those other 2 points that I mentioned. So this is kind of a summary of where I think we are right now in a kind of statement, at least from my perspective, of the, let's say, how do you say this? Kind of the condensate of the last meetings. There's something that kind of got sedimented for me as an important kind of idea. So I think that we have right now a description of capitalist social formations from the standpoint of this thing that we call objective phenomenology, right? Meaning that it describes a social world from the standpoint of certain of its objects, not from the standpoint of a theory or from the standpoint of, let's say, a universal thing. It's a whole description, both of, I mean, the case of the primer, mostly of industrial capitalism from the standpoint of money, from the standpoint of capital, from the standpoint of competition, right? There are objects, and in this sense, money, capital, competition, monopoly structures, they are objects, and they see things in the world, right? And we can use this, and this description already kind of applies to other layers. We can talk about something very similar when talking about how sovereignty sees states, or how, or in its citizens, or how myths see other myths. We can use that to talk about in a consistent way about the social world, right? So now we are looking for a theory of organization developed under the same premises. So we want to stay with that premise of objective phenomenology and start building this theory of organization. And what I meant that is kind of sedimented for me is the idea that these three things here kind of give a good orientation of how to move towards that direction. The first point is that the compositional structure of an organization determines what differences make a difference to it. So the idea that depending on how an organization is built, different things will matter, right? Not in the theoretical sense or the moral sense or something like that, or out of principle, but simply because it will sense different things in the very same way that we talked about these objects seeing things, right? So objects, organizations considered as objects, they will be in a position to see different things depending on how these objects are structured, right? And this would bring together a compositional point of view. How are they structured? How did you take parts of a situation and reorganize them? And the informational, in the sense of what differences make a difference, how the differences matter. So you connect composition and information. Then the second point is that the informational structure of an organization is determined by the ways it interacts with its environment. So when we're talking about things making a difference to an organization, we're not talking about, again, let's say simply how it thinks itself or something like that. We're talking about how it interacts with a social environment. So depending on how an organization is structured, let's say it includes a certain heterogeneous group of people, certain social constraints of this multi-layered world will affect it and others won't, right? So there is a connection between these differences that exist for an organization and the ways it interacts with the rest of the world. So the first step connects composition, how you structure, with what information counts. The second step mixes what information counts with how it interacts or how it intervenes, right? And then the third point is that the interactive dimension of an organization, if it is a political organization, therefore it's not simply, let's say, its aims are not reducible to interact with the environment so that it doesn't disappear. You're not simply, let's say, a company that's trying to survive or to compete. You have a different aim. So there is a qualifier to this process. So if it is political, it's required to produce something new and to find ways to make it consist beyond the limits of the organization itself. So it kind of ties back the interactional, the fact that you are interacting with the world, with the compositional, because the outcome of that interaction is that things get recomposed. So this goes back here, right? So that last step is the one that would qualify the whole process as an experimental one, because you compose things in a way such that certain things make a difference. That difference requires you to interact with how the rest of the world is composed. And this leads you to recompose something in a different way afterwards, right? So something like this, perhaps. Right? So we have three questions here. How does material composition constrain and shape differences? Shape what differences constitute, let's say, the information channels for a system? As we were saying, for example, if you are a small Marxist reading group of mostly academic professors with tenure, theory-wise, you're talking about the structure of the capitalist system. But organization-wise, there's almost nothing in the world that makes a difference to that group. Like wages go up and down, it doesn't change anything. Transportation gets crappier, it doesn't change anything, right? Racist segregation gets worse, probably won't change anything because they're all whites, right? So you see what you're talking about, like the way that those people are organized is affecting what makes a difference, what they can be affected by, right? The second arrow here is asking how are interventions in an environment and its responses connected to this information structure. So once you have that organization built up, how is it then embedded in the world again? So how is that the things that make a difference for it, how does it react to it, what does it do, and so on? And third, how can interventions in the world be structured so that things that didn't have form or that didn't make a difference are kind of absorbed by that process, right? So I'm not adding them as directed lines as if it's going like this, but that could be a way of understanding it if you want. Does that make sense? This whole Yasha, please tell me the part that this part is the good yes and no.
So this slide, I'm still figuring out this slide. I got distracted for a second and then I lost you.
Don't worry, it's probably
material conversion to screen. Composition.
Could it be rephrased like the way you're composed, like you're an agent and you're like you have a brain, so your brain is how you're composed, and then it gives you certain conditions to sense certain stuff, so to sense certain difference in the world and also like intervene in a certain way. So the way you're composed structured like a space of interventions and a space of things you can sense. And by engaging this process of through your senses and actions and interact with something that's not yourself or maybe parts of yourself, you get to learn and to kind of like on one hand learn what you're made out, your internal about your internal composition, about what you can do. So the fact that you're composed and can do stuff doesn't mean that you know what you can do and what you can sense. So it depends on you being able to actually interact and kind of like learn not only about how the world is made, but how your own like organs function. And that also allows you to kind of like recompose yourself based on that. And that's the kind of more like experimental like hypothesis, what allows you to like update your beliefs and internal like functioning. Would that be more or less?
I think it has a lot to do with that. But imagine like my intuitive understanding that this arrow here is talking, the question that it's asking is what sense, like in the sense of like perception, right? From the stuff that you have, what can you like? What sort of sensor can you build to the world, right? So what can you perceive? So, for example, is the process of having some sort of material in your body and it's reactive to light, right? So light makes a difference there. So there is some process through which some material being burnable and regenerating at the back of your eye turns this sort of undirected physical interaction into an information channel in some level, right? So how do we get to that from some material, right? So how do things being composed in some way gets us to what can count as a difference, right? Because in some level you can analyze your senses in that way, like you're being sensitive to air pressure, being sensitive to light fluctuations or intensity of light, something like that, right? But then that's not enough, because there is something that turns this sort of sense data, right, into more meaningful information because of what you can do with it, right? The fact that you can sense a kind of a black spot in your view, or a darker spot in your view, and you can move away and closer to it, and it also moves, it becomes smaller or bigger, right? Those correlations between how you change something, a parameter, and you sense something differently, is now kind of probing that space in finding correlations, so interaction and information are kind of moving together, right?
So what this reminds me of is, maybe tell me if I sound crazy, but almost like if you take it's like the scientific method, but not the scientific method in the sense of as it works in science for science. Because, right, when you observe natural systems, there's different considerations that you have to to account than with social systems. But this is almost like if you apply almost like something like a forgetful functor to scientific experiments to general experimentation, right?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, because I think we're coming close to an idea of experimentation. That is the thing that we have in common between, let's say, artistic experimentation, romantic experimentation, scientific experimentation. There is something that allows us to use the word for all those things, right? So what are we talking about? And it's funny because the only place where this is not usually used is politics. Like from Badiou's procedures, like we know what an artistic experiment is. We know what scientific experiments are. Romantic experiments in a way are also kind of known, but political ones are harder to define, right? Yeah. So I think that's what we're kind of leaning towards with this, right? And I think that what distinguishes why is this then needed? Because, for example, this is where I think we distinguish experience from experimentation. Like, so we have sense, you have something like kind of your capacity now to understand about objects in the environment through that sense, right? For example, if I move closer and further and the blob stays constant, it seems like it's in my eye. Or if, for example, it's an interference in the experiment, right? It doesn't correlate with anything in an object system, in an environment. But if I move closer and further away and it becomes bigger and smaller, it looks like something outside correlates with some data I have from this specific kind of instrument that I created, right? But there are two things you could do. You can just have an experience of this, which my impression is actually when this goes back, which is to say, the important thing about experience is that you remain yourself, right? It refers back to you, right? Whereas in terms of it, you're discovering things about yourself. For example, I'm seeing something new, I'm moving somewhere else. It's always localized on you. It's always kind of taking you as the map, the center of the map. Where experiments is not about you, right? That's why the instrument or the eye you want to use is not your own eye. It's some mechanical eye, right? So it wants to probe into something new, not about you as an observer, but something new about the observed thing, right? That's why I think that there is an arrow going back to composition, because it's it's almost like experiments are a smaller region of experience, broadly construed, not necessarily human experience, but a smaller part of interactions with the environment that are concerned with extracting new information about these objects, right? I'm not satisfied with knowing that if I'm close, it's big, and if I'm far away, it's small. That still has me as the relevant kind of index. I want to know, well, if I compare it with something that is not me, or if everyone comes close and further away, does this correlation maintain itself or not, right? So this is a bit the thing that we've been talking about in a couple of meetings, that I said it's kind of a sort of weird trinity to think organization, right? There is the how is it structured, how it intervenes in the world, and what is intelligible for it. And the idea that these three things are connected. How you structure something, how it can, depending on how it's structured, it might or might not be able to intervene in one or another way. And it might not be able to sense certain things, right? So that kind of connects these 3 points here. So I'm kind of focusing on this just because I think it makes the other points make more sense. The first one, not so much because we already discussed it, but I think it, in a way, it also clarifies, because when we read that paper on behavioral meteorology and we were talking about this sort of possibility of talking about how constraints or restrictions are passed between parts of objects and things like this, it kind of offers a door to talk about, well, can't we just describe all objects in a social world as kind of being kind of space of constraints? This could clarify when we talk about this thing here, and we say, okay, sense, what can you sense, right? It's not like news organizations are going to sense new states of matter or new fundamental particles. They sense, let's say, the limit or the reach or the force of a certain constraint, right? So, for example, if you put 1,000 white conservative people on the streets, you won't feel many forces coming against it, really. But if you put other people on the streets, suddenly the police is there, suddenly certain aspects of the state and of, you know, property protection are clear. So you interact with those constraints, property constraints, state constraints, commodity constraints, they become clearer. If you try to organize, you know, a more popular protest, for example, monetary constraints will pretty much filter through and prevent a lot of people from being on the street because they need to work and they need to, they can't afford it, right? So because we were structured in a way, some constraints, some objects made of constraints became legible, right? They are informative. And we are also in condition to interact with them in one or another way, right?
Do you say that those 3 points have the same form and the same constraints, or
These 3 things?
yeah?
I don't know. Yeah, because the way that I'm thinking about this is that there is, like, we know some stuff that helps to think this. We actually discussed a lot these ideas of how morphisms are composed, how category theory helps us to think about these objects as being these parts and wholes things. But we started looking, for example, in the case of the primer, we were able to show that because money is composed in a certain way, it can get consistent information about value, and that this constrains the production space. So you have the 3 things. They complement each other, right? In a way.
So information come from what? From like universals? Because value, for example, comes from right? Money is a universal, and accumulation of value also, right?
Yeah, but you see, this is exactly the point. Like, there is a specific structure behind money that makes it work as a universal equivalent, right? And the very expression universal equivalent means that you can take it close, let's say, like an instrument. You can take it close to any commodity, and it will give you an observation which is meaningful, right?
Yeah.
And not only that, but if you want to keep that information alive, so if you want to be able to use prices to sense meaningful constraints on, no, this you cannot exchange, yes, this you can exchange, you need to preserve the composition of objects, right? Objects need to be composed of other commodities. They cannot lose value when they're being produced. They need to preserve the value. So these three points here, they pretty much cover, I mean, I think that, and this, I really think it's a profound thing. This thing here explains, or let's say, decouples, or I don't know how to decomposes aspects of the money form. And with the same logic, we can start talking about organization. So we are really close to a perspective that treats economy and organization with the same tools. Like you can describe money as something that does this route. It's composed in a certain way.
Yeah. Go.
Right? It's composed in a certain way. Because of this, it preserves a certain information and constrains the world in a certain way that preserves that composition, and so on and so forth. Right? So there is, we already saw those different sides of this kind of basic theory or basic strategy at play in describing how money works or how capital works or things like this. And without changing the basis of it, we now can ask the same questions of other things. How should an organization be structured so that it can kind of sense a certain information or make it intelligible, right? And what sort of constraints does this impose on how it relates to the environment, how the environment relates back to it, and so on. So in that sense, I think it's an advance that we already made. Like we have a couple of ideas, very basic, we haven't developed them yet, but they, at least on the surface, they already apply to economics and political organization. That's why I think this is kind of a basic building block to look for the material that makes this idea hold, you know? So, and it's a bit in that spirit that I went looking for stuff. The first thing, again, as I said, is something we already saw, which is just the possibility of, I would say, giving, let's say, a power analysis of things we gave an economic or transcendental analysis, right? Because if we can treat these objects as constraints on actions, it clarifies, in my opinion, what is this information you're sensing, depending on how you're structured, right? Because just when we talk about these different layers, like the commodity layer, the community layer, the contract layer, this I think facilitates the phenomenology of it. Like, what are these objects in reality, right? Why are they not visible as, like, it's not a matter of looking at buildings, right? Even though the buildings can embody those constraints. Like, for example, if you have a bump on the road, it is a state constraint on velocity that was actually embedded in the material, right? The material is acting as a constraint, don't go over a certain speed. But the important part is the constraint, the important part that makes that object, right? So the first thing that I thought would be a useful path not to let go is the behavioral meteorology thing. So I did this with all the papers that I thought we could talk about. Just like, what does it do, right? I think that this project allows us to describe objects categorically as being structured by different constraints on the space of possible behaviors of the system. So you have like a system, and there are ways of talking about parts of that system that are actually restrictions of the behavior. So there's the set of all behaviors of the system, and then you can have the set of the behaviors that correspond to that particular part. And by looking at the space of behaviors, you actually get the object back, right? So you can describe it fully in that way. So as just constraints on the space of behaviors of the system. So given an object, we can define its parts and the order structure of them. So what part is belonging to what part and what part is included in what part, based on how they allow for or fully determine the possible behavior of other parts, right? So they build up these different operators of allowing, guaranteeing, a sort of modal language, right? I think the really strong thing that really makes this useful is that if you look for certain, how do you say, determination. So if you look at the parts that fully determine one another, you actually get to reconstruct the order the lattice of parts of the object, right? So you can actually
I just jump in. That's really nice, because then we don't need to have pre-existing objects. We can look at the world of constraints and build our objects retroactively through basically gluing constraints together, right? Whenever we see a consistency between a constraint over here and a constraint over there, we can hypothesize that they belong to some common body. We don't even know what that common thing is yet, right? And this has, I think, everything to do with experiments, right? Because the whole thing is we don't know the precise interactions and the precise information channels and compositions. We have to make a guess.
Yeah, and this is very Platonic. I was thinking about this. Like in the Republic, Plato says that the ideal city would be one where the relation between one person suffering and another person ethical position should be just like the one where one hand gets cut, but the other hand belongs to the same body. It looks like Wittgenstein, like says one would like to say, that if the other is suffering, it would be tempting to say that I am suffering in the same sense that a hand would say of the other hand, if the other hand is hurt. So there is this kind of metaphor of constraints of hands and the body that looks actually like the example from this text. So I thought that this could help us redescribe social objects just as the set of constraints on actions or behaviors, right? So it would, exactly as Danny said, it would help us bridge the gap between the structural description of objects in the primer, which is very structural, it's very kind of abstract. You have these commodity arrows, commodity maps, right? And you build stuff only from that, but you always get this sort of, I think we managed to do it well, but it's sometimes unconvincing the way that value and use of objects are related. And I think that if you just understand value as a constraint or money as a constraint, it's easier to understand that abstract labor is constraint preserving labor, right? It's preserving the possibility that that object, once produced, will command some value, meaning it will carry over certain constraints, right? So it might even help with that. And I think it also clarifies, for example, when discussing states. I mean, it gives I really think it brings a sort of, if you want a theory of abstract power, right? Theory of power that stems directly from the structural view of capitalism, abstract domination. Yeah, but how does abstract domination look like? Well, it looks like a certain weird structure of passing constraints, right? And it also looks like the fact that not always you can tell how, even though things are very far apart, they're actually connected. And so the objects that actually bring them together can be very elusive, right? So it seems like it could help with that. I did this for all the texts, just like some intuitive connections. And I think that for the behavioral meteorology text, that's actually the one that the connections are the clearest, right? So I don't think we should go into these things like it's not my purpose for us to already give a good account of these things, but just to kind of motivate that the project is worth pursuing, like in a more refined way, right? So the way that they describe this functional restriction, the quotienting from the behavior type of the whole to the behavior type of the part, it looks a lot like the phenomenal components in logics of worlds. You have a sort of equivalence relation on behaviors of parts of the system that make them equivalent, right? So you'd say that you can reduce a certain mapping, right? Some partition from the system to a part, just to the case where the two behaviors are now indistinguishable. So if you move from, rather than talk about the whole part P, you can talk about a particular behavior inside that part, such that two behaviors there are equivalent. So it has this sort of atomic feel to it, where you reach a certain level of indistinct behavior. Beyond that level, behaviors are no longer distinctive, right? They have a theory of compatibility, a theory of determination, which seems and which allows you to take this kind of order back, right? Recuperate the idea of how the parts are ordered, and it also has a lot to do with this different aspects of Badiou's atomic logic. So it all seems, I think, from all the texts we've read, is the one that has the strongest logics of worlds flavor, right? So it looks like it wouldn't be such a stretch to connect the two things more clearly and take the third step of connecting it to like the basics of the primer, for example. I see some challenges in doing that. I mean, personally, I'm still having trouble with the whole existential universal quantification. You guys did a really good job explaining it last time, but it just didn't stick in my head. I probably need to go back to that video. A lot of stuff here that I really didn't have clarity just from their text, like how you construct this lattice of, you know, the meets between different parts and the disjoint unions and the joints and so on, and how those three edge joints go together. I mean, the whole text is a bit quick at points for me. I wonder also, because one of the points of the text is that to work with those predicates, constraints as predicates, you have a classical structure, right? Either something has the predicate or it doesn't, if I'm not mistaken. And we're not always, for example, in the case of the capitalist world, we're not dealing with classical logic, right? So you can have more or less of the value predicate or of the money predicate.
Yeah, yes, but I don't think it fundamentally changes.
It's good to know. Yeah, I mean, it's just questions that raised that appeared for me. And another thing that I thought was very promising is that one of the main models that they use, one of the main examples that they use, is also used in one of the other texts I wanted to mention, which is the basic dynamic system everyone quotes, which is the predator-prey model, that Lotka-Volterra model with the foxes and the rabbits and how one thing constrains the other. When you get to the resource sharing machines, they also use the same example and they reconstruct it as well. So it's probably an example that could be used to find the bridge between the two, for example. So again, it's just, I didn't want to go into detail of this, but it just seems to me like from everything we discussed, there is a very kind of clear investigation that is possible of just going back to stuff that we already covered and seeing if this alternative description is not possible, because it seems to have very clear merits, you know, of making this more structural presentation of money, commodity, and other aspects where things are not, I mean, things would look less cohesive, I guess, if we think sovereigns are connected with people, money is connected with objects, things, right? Communities are connected with God knows what, and then they seem substantially different. Whereas if you give them all this sort of more constrained structure, they're all kind of just ways of passing on constraints and so on, they look more homogeneous. So it might facilitate talking about these multi-layers and how one thing actually acts on the other as well. But that's, let's say, if we go back to that previous thing, right? That's why I added it to this first thing, because ultimately I think it's we're still kind of going through things we already did, right? It's covering the same kind of space of questions, right?
Yeah, I think this is really interesting, especially the thing you mentioned about trying to use behavioral meteorology as a way to think about power analysis in a different way. And I think the really good thing that this could bring is allow it to be composable, right, with what you guys are doing, the primer, with these other projects. but also because I think it might help to give a better model and way to think about how power works on like a less individual or more on a higher scale, and how it moves through scales, I guess, that kind of thing.
Yeah, exactly. I think that this is something that I was thinking of, that, for example, there is something about constraints in communities or at the level of reciprocity, where there is a certain mechanism of making it personal, even when it's not. Like the wind does something, or the weather, and there is actually a part of the logic personalizes that power. It's the power of somebody acting on someone else, right? That's why magic, and you can negotiate with nature and so on. Whereas with capital is weird, because the constraint comes from an impersonal thing, and it hits you as an impersonal constraint as well, right? So when we have a multi-layered logic, we can start talking about, let's say, ways in which impersonal things can get personalized due to the ways communities are structured, for example, right? So, for example, this is something we were talking to Hanzo. Hanzo was here yesterday as well. He just went back to São Paulo this morning. But we were talking about this very weird thing. And there's a really good text, I'm not going to find it now, I did find it. There's a really good text by a researcher called Rebecca Carson, called Fictitious Capital and the Re-Emergence of Personal Forms of Domination, that connect very nicely to this topic, because she's studying the way that the more capital becomes abstract and its constraints on the world are harder to kind of localize where they're coming from, actually the more concrete personal forms of domination re-emerge. But they now have, because they have this sort of impersonal backdrop, nobody's to blame, right? When people are not to blame because things are just that way, they can actually be much more violent, because they're not the ultimate responsible for it, right? So you can actually get very complicated relations between impersonal, for example, debt. Everyone becomes indebted because of a structural pattern in society, but debt collection is very personal, very violent sometimes. But the guy who's collecting the debt and threatening you, he can count on that impersonal thing. So you get weird mixes of these things, right? So just to say, I think that there is a lot to unpack there that we could use, and that connects with the theory of power. Talking about theory of power also, have you guys seen this Huey Newton quote? Oh my God, I always forget how you write Huey.
H-U-E-Y, right?
Yeah, this quote here, it really felt like it's a really good, just add it here. This one, it says, to us, power is the ability to define phenomena. I mean, a Black Panther in a very concrete struggle, talking about, power being connected with the capacity to see a phenomena, right? And then constraints, the ability to make this phenomena act in a desired manner. Mm-hmm. I mean, I found it very kind of quite incredible to find such a perfect motto for the project, in the Black Panther kind of slogans and so on. But
yeah,
again,
a wonderful quote.
It's such a good quote, isn't it?
Yeah.
So, and it goes back to that idea, right? I mean, isn't that quote pretty much this thing here, right? It has something to do with how you compose so that you can actually see phenomena, and then how you can act on it, pushing it in a certain direction, right? But you cannot push something in a direction that you can't really interact with. So you need to be structured in a way that you can actually interact with it. Yeah, so, but those three, I think behavioral meteorology would be, let's say, considering this this diagram here that we did, it's kind of like the background here. It's a possible redescription of the whole thing, right? But it's not really connected with a specific one of the three. And I think we decided this before you arrived, Dennis, but there was a suggestion to keep the meeting short and just do another one to cover more stuff, just so we don't get exhausted, and the videos are also shorter.
Yeah, that works for me.
So I'll just cover point 3 and just mention the other two, and then we can go over them next time. But I think that this point 3 here is the one that actually starts. I mean, I'm a bit. It's not that much actually once you go through it in detail, but I think it starts talking about this first arrow here, right? So there is. I think that this. Especially the specific paper is the first paper in that thing I sent you guys, this paper called An Algebra of Resource Sharing Machines by this Sophie Lipkind. And she's part of this group that is kind of studying open dynamical systems in categorical terms. And it seems like the paper got me really excited because it's the first thing I found that tries to account for how composition, like how a material kind of system and an information system can constrain one another. So, so basically the formalism for these resource sharing machines, it combines a compositional approach to resource-based systems, which they define as systems where communication is not directed. So for example, a mechanical physical system where a billiard ball interacts with another one, actually both interact with each other. There is not one thing is the sender and the other is the receiver of an input, right? And interaction is passive in that sense. So they combine a compositional description of this sort of thing, a very broad kind of coarse-grained description of dynamical systems that are, they call resource-based, right? To another one, which is more like operettes for like wiring diagrams for like machine systems, things like this. So in the case where communication is directed, you have inputs and outputs, right? And inputs trigger things on some other part of the system and so on, right? So it kind of goes in the direction, but actually the stuff that they already have is very kind of, from what I understand, I thought it very interesting, but it's also very restricted. But it kind of starts giving us material or kind of technical means to talk about how material structure, so for example, a physical system, conditions and interacts with the informational structure. So the sort of more input-output mode of systems, right? And how those levels can compose together. So you have a system which has both inputs and outputs, and it has this exposed parts that are just connecting material, for example, a resource, right? And how you can treat a system that has those two dimensions and talk about them composing with other systems and things like that, right? So it seems like it helped us as a sort of first step in addressing this particular question that I'm having a hard time finding good literature on it, which is how do different forms of composition affect the type of information that a system is sensible to, right? So we could use the insight from this research to explore the connection between materials of a site, in the sense that Badiou talks about the site as being the sort of intermission of something that is not logically typified in a world, right? And the creation of new dependence relations with that world, which is more logical and information based, right? And to use a lingo that Dennis suggested the other day, how does, for example, to use an example, cooperation in a production site, workers cooperate, and for contingent reasons, that cooperative process emerges as a common resource, right? It's not simply something that appears in the product as a surplus, value, but it's actually appearing as the corporation itself, the set of relations between workers that is larger than the stuff that they can do individually. What sort of difference can start making a difference to a collective of workers that is kind of structured around that cooperative kind of structure having emerged, right? For example, there are some things that now they count. For example, before, the fact that everyone comes into the factory and they leave as private owners of their labor power, that they negotiate privately as separate workers, that was fine, right? And making a package deal, like, or working separately, that didn't really matter. And now if you're treated as a cooperative, for example, if a person decides to negotiate a deal separately, that makes a difference, right? So differences started making a difference that previously they didn't, because of some common resource now being included. So you see, it's kind of in the same kind of general ballpark of problem.
Gabriel, do you think, is this related to the kind of point you normally bring, like with Rosen, on how, because how like state spaces come about? Like what's the, normally like modeling already assume a given state space, and that's always has been like a question I've always had. Like in your science, you always assume that the natural thing to do is to model. When you look at neurons, you see them firing or not. Like it's obvious that that's the relevant thing, but there's no theory that tells you why that's, like, why starting from a black box, what's this, the state space that is actually, that tells you, like, yeah, you don't have a theory about how to choose state space. So do you think it's related to this?
Yeah, I
bridges composition with the kind of like parameter space that is relevant.
I wish it was like, then I try to go through the, like, this is the sort of thing that the paper will do. Okay, it's very specific. Like it will give you systems like the one I built here, where it has like these red arrows. You see, they are not directed arrows. It's an area very connected with that other thing that discusses like Petri nets, you know, where you have like each thing has actually tokens inside, and then it limits how many, let's say, pings it can give to another part of the system, or how much interaction it can give. So for example, you can imagine that there are some resources here, right? So for example, X shares resource with W, right? And Y shares resource with Z. But there's another set of blue arrows here that define the inputs and outputs. So for example, X1 can send something from X to Y, but that depletes X. And because it depletes X, it will also deplete W, right? But at the same time, X is sending something, Z is sending something to W, and that therefore gives something back to W and something back to X as well. I think they actually take it a bit further, because it doesn't need to be like a extensional substrate that you're sharing or not sharing, and that you're exhausting or you're consuming. It's anything, right? Any sort of interaction that is not directed. So it's anything that looks like the sort of interaction in a physical system, for example. But we could find other things that have this sort of common pool sense to it, right? It's affecting everyone that's part of that in some determinate relational sense. And they managed to show that you can compose this, all of this as one system, and give it this added layer, right? If you look the connections, and I just added the stuff that they do, it does give like the feel that you could use this sort of undirected red arrows to talk about, let's say, what we call the use value structure in the primer. Because, for example, when a hammer hits some material, right, both the hammer affects the material and the material affects the hammer. It's the undirected dimension of labor. right? It's just systems interacting with systems. You can't say that it's going one way because you're producing an object, but in a certain sense, it's also depleting labor. It's also exhausting, like destroying the tool. It's undirected the way things affect each other. Value is directed, right? Value is the thing that actually goes in one way rather than another. So we could use it perhaps to give that sort of use the resource sharing system to talk about this use value transformation, and talk about machine composition to talk about commodity production and value transfer. It does give the feel, if you read the stuff, that perhaps if you're interested in slightly different processes, it could already have the machinery to talk about, let's say, how something that was below a site, right? If you take this sort of object to be something like this, and there is something below which all this material doesn't count, right? In the logic of that space. Perhaps we could use it to imagine, okay, this is therefore not really, this might be structured, but it's not structured by the logic of the world. It's not really part of what counts as information in that world. So if we were to kind of plug it into the world, right, it wouldn't be plugged in as just something that makes a difference. It has no information for that world. So it can only come in as a sort of resource still to be kind of pushed into work in some way, right? So it seems like it could be used in interesting ways, but it's not very clear how to make these connections from the text. It is the closest thing I found to a text dealing directly with the question we were talking about, right? How does composition constrain information? But I guess that we would have to read some of the stuff in the text. And I mean, there's a lot of stuff that, I mean, I have barely managed to understand from the way that he uses this different, for example, this is the actual construction of it. It has this index category with a certain section that goes to this lens. And if you have this, then you have a syntax for composing open dynamical systems that have these 3 boxes, right? That will have like a box they call M box, which has no direction, and then inputs and outputs. But how far this is already kind of in the direction of that question, right? Of actually allowing you to define what is, let's say, differential unit, as you were saying, like what counts as a state space, right? It's not very clear to me if they already got there, or if that's actually a question that they want to answer. So from all the text, I think this is the one that poses the most direct question, but answers the least direct answer, like to the sort of things we were talking about. I mean, just to go very quickly, not go into detail, but these are the other 2 things I wanted to talk about. I'll just try to get into them next week. One is this, which is something we spoke of for a couple of meetings. Like we went over it very briefly in a couple of meetings, which is this sort of big project in applied category theory for sort of redescription of cybernetics that includes, let's say, all the machinery to talk about machine learning, open games, and other things that have a certain sense, a certain idea of knobs or parameters that you can change in your intervention. They have an idea of sensors or rewards or something that gathers observations. It has agents and environments, right?
Something like an agent theory, like the most general way.
Yeah, I think the most general thing that they ended up doing is a kind of agent theory. Yeah, like from what I understood, pretty much you have like, this is the cheapest version of the basic building block, which is what they call lenses, right? Which was used in, I don't know, some sort of computer science thing. it just takes like a state, says it, then has this function, and then you have this feedback structure that uses the state to compose back the return signal, right? Then optics just takes this kind of saved memory state and turns it into a more kind of independent parameter, right? They call it residual. So you have this first feed forward operation. It leaves a residual, which can be forgetful. It doesn't need to be the perfect state that was kept. It's just some information on it, right? And then you have the feedback. And then they actually construct the category of these residuals, which is this kind of parametric, this kind of category of parameters. And when they add the possibility that parameters are changed, right, that you can have reparameterizations, then they say, well, this little machine here looks like an agent. Like you could formalize agency because you can have some parameter for function. Then when you see the return, you have the residual of the parameter you used, and this can give you back some observation that you can now change the parameter for the next intervention, right? And it seems like what this alpha thing is what will ultimately, like what what this alpha thing is will define if you're talking about a controller where pretty much the observation might almost fully determine the parameter, right? In a more direct way. If you have a complicated gradient descent, crazy algorithm with this loss function that will give you machine learning, or if you have something else like a set of strategies or some basic hypotheses or something like that, right?
I think also another thing about the reparameterized optics at the end is to think of it as like the entire thing as one, not as like these two separate, like this reparameterization part that like updates the parameters inside. Oh no, sorry, go back one sec. Just back here. But as like one single thing. So for example, that we can, I mean, I think the goal of it is so that you can explain these like both like machine learning in the sense of what we actually do with computers in the very limited way that they do them now, and how to describe that in a way that also includes agency in like the most general way. But like, for example, if we consider like a human agent like this, we don't have any way to separate what is this like alpha thing, which is like, how do we change, maybe like change our beliefs or change our ways of thinking, right? That's like the learning part. That's how it updates.
Yeah, but you know what's really interesting, just to go back to something we said before, which is that, well, now you have, let's say, a bunch of functions here, right, of this form. They take the input of parameter and the output, and they send it to a new parameter, a new kind of Q space, right? And depending on how these reparameterizations are structured, you can start separating agency from identity. So there is some structure to this process, right? It's actually, if I'm not mistaken, this is like this, and it has some conditions of its own. So you can talk, for example, about if you have a parameter, kind of a general strategy for changing your parameters, such that some basic principles remain the same, or such that some part of the strategies are always the same, you could say is the same agent. But if this reparameterization goes very far in that space, it can actually not cover the same basic principles, and you would have a measure of saying this is no longer the same agent, right? So you could have, let's say, a theory of what does it mean to be an agent, not to have agency. You can separate the two things. You might have agency with no identifiable agents, right? So that seems very useful for us because people are always confused, and it's hard to work through this idea of how do you associate strategy and action when you don't have, let's say, one clear identifiable revolutionary subject, or how do you talk about agency in a scale that is not the scale of individual identification or group identification, right? So the fact that they managed to capture something about agency in this space of how parameters change, how they change based on how they're reacting to what was sensed and so on. It gives a certain, starts giving a bit of a clearer contour to, let's say, how it's possible that strategies propagate, and as you treat some material, treat some interact with the world in a certain way, and even though those interactions are keeping up with some strategy, it might not preserve in the nitty-gritty of it, like in a more specific way, right? It might not be preserving, let's say, the identity of the agent, right? So I feel like the limit, in my opinion, of the connection between what they're doing and what we're interested in is that since the object of study is like mostly open games and machine learning, it needs to treat these reparameterizations with a very specific formal machinery, because it wants to talk about, right, differential equations and how you kind of take some information out of the loss function and so on. It doesn't necessarily interest us. Open games, I don't know enough to know how far you can take it in the same direction, but I think political strategy is something slightly different, right? Because again, as we said in the beginning, you're not interested simply in winning, because sometimes you need to learn what it means to win while you're playing it, right? It's not that the strategy to win is built as you're playing, is that what it means to win is also built as you're playing. That's perhaps what not makes it a game, it makes it more like an experiment, right?
Yeah, so the difference between the bottom left para optics and the bottom right is like, bottom left is kind of a single strategy, whereas bottom right is like a space of strategies that you're exploring.
Yeah, I think that's
Something
kind
like
of
that.
how it goes. Yeah, I added very quickly here how they do the whole thing. So reparameterization, just it takes that P and Q. Yeah, this is something, I mean, there are a lot of stuff I don't understand here, but actually it's weird because this reparameterization is itself an optic, right? So changing this alpha to such that you don't have parameters P and your observations Q, but P prime and Q prime, the structure of that transformation is itself an optic. I don't know what that means or how that works, but it's optics all the way, it seems, with this guy, right? So they use the same formalism for many parts of the construction, and they give you the rules of composition and so on. So it does seem to, I mean, the way that I understand this is that it kind of unpacks, just at this part here, it unpacks a bit, I think, how you treat, like how we think about points in Badiou's sense. Like once you have, for example, to go back to the example that we gave before, right? From the standpoint of resource sharing machines, you would have, if we just use the question that was at stake there, some new resource comes to the picture. Workers form a certain cooperative common basis, or workers in a factory share something in common with women doing housework, right? You suddenly form this sort of thing that is partaking in a similar underlying matter, which is pretty much, I mean, an intuitive understanding of what the inexistence for Badiou concerns, something that didn't make a difference, but it's there in the ontological substrate, right, of the situation. So the first question would be, how does this come to interact with the other constraints in the world? How can it come to change constraints, right? Okay, so then the next question is, okay, but how can you ask questions of the world and meaningfully understand the answer to those questions once you bring those new kind of elements into play, right? And you kind of want to, on the one hand, but you treat it as kind of new questions with a yes or no answer. Do things connect with the event or don't they? Do new other workers join in or they don't? Do you negotiate or do you go on strike? Things like very yes or no. But in a certain sense, you might want to look at this process in a more kind of fleshed out way. the first point that I see that we should flesh out is that Badiou treats these points as functions, right? Taking from the, in our sense, would be the constraints of the world to the material, this classical support, and seeing if it has some bearing on the material. But the functions themselves, like these phi's of the points, he says that the actual question, which has an answer yes or no, it actually depends very much on the specifics of the situation, right? It might have a yes or no answer, but the question itself requires you to know the meaningful restrictions of the world. And he doesn't really say much about that. He doesn't say much about how do you formulate the good question. And formulating a good question seems to have to do with what are the proper parameters for an interaction, right? So this kind of agency description kind of seems to give more material to talk about something that for Badiou seems to be like a black box, right? Which just is a point, and then you get a yes or no answer. Like, will you join us? Yes or no. Seems to be like the sort of general thing, but that's not the only thing you can play with when you're trying to construct something, right? So it seems to me that this would brings us help to move forward in that direction. There's a bunch of stuff there again that I still very poorly familiar with. How to understand lenses? Do they connect in any way with the formalisms that we were looking into? From the operette kind of structures we did for production processes, they seem to have some connection, but I'm not sure if it's just because of diagrams. So it's not clear if the relation between observation and intervention that they can formalize are enough to talk about tactics and strategy in a political sense. They don't really go into, because I mean, there's not that much material on this as well. It's very kind of vanguard of applied category theory. They don't really talk about how to compose agents very much, and how this space of possible strategies, what sort of structure do we have there, and how can we talk about it in more refined ways, right? Then there is this nice thing we spoke about that also makes this field very interesting, which is the kind of encapsulated in this nice little diagram, which is the fact that a system with this sort of reparameterizing agency surrounded by an environment, right, which gives you the initial state, has a continuation and kind of surrounds it with parts which are also not interacting with. This comb around the system, right? It's actually an optic itself. So the internal part is an optic, but you can also look at the outer environment as an optic as well. So in some level, the description of the system and the description of this kind of environment it is interacting with, at some point you could shift the perspective because you already have the formal tools to do so. It's just not meaningful to do it most of the time, right? To consider you as part of the environment. But for that purpose of kind of moving from composition of organizations to looking at a set of organizations as a sort of economic field, right? For example, to ask the question, what would a capitalist endeavor look like in a highly egalitarian ecosystem where everyone is working in a cooperative way? That would be, let's say, the worldly constraints, and the capitalist guy would be the individual guy going against the grain, right? That would kind of give us the shift of perspective back from organizations to economies, right? So this kind of approach also has that nice feel to it, that it could go that direction. But again, there are many things to look more carefully that we could see. Then the last thing, I'm not even going to go into it now, but is that one thing we could do is, if this seems so general, this reparameterizable optic stuff, that it seems like it could possibly be a sort of framework under certain specific parameters, specific ways of creating observation and so on, we could kind of nest this theory of experiments, right? Like you could treat this thing here as having many different parameter spaces, many different kind of state spaces and ways you can interact with it. But there are specific ways of doing this, which we could call experimental under certain conditions, which are not very clear yet, right? So I looked into these two papers. The first one is one we were talking about before the meeting, and the other one is a one that's a bit more technical. But they try to give, let's say, categorical descriptions of what experiments are like, or how we could start approaching description of experiments in terms of morphisms, functors, and things from category theory. And I thought the two texts are interesting, but I don't think they go. The second text goes much further and might have useful things, but it's not very easy to use it. You know, I'm not sure. I would like to study them a bit more. But yeah, that's pretty much like the. I mean, that's where I mean, this experiment text is the one that brings these other things into play that I also don't understand very well. What the hell are Frobenius monads? What the hell is the adjoint functor theorem? How comma categories work and things like this. It does suggest somehow that we could, like, they all deal with these three basic kind of categories that you would need to explain the theory of an experiment. This sort of system category, instruments, and a register space. So it all seems very, very relatable to the other stuff we already covered now. But again, still very vague. I thought that I could go into more detail of these two last points on the optics and the experiments next week, just so we don't go over time too much. We agreed to do a shorter meeting. But yeah, we talked about a lot of stuff. But I mean, the reason why I think this is useful, I mean, it's exciting. It's just because when you look into the papers themselves, they do share a lot of stuff, you know, like the resource sharing machines, they rely on lenses to make sense of the connection between the resource and the machine-like systems. The optics has this kind of very native way of talking about, you know, parameters or knobs and sensors and agents, and it doesn't seem like a stretch to exchange like these knobs of controllers for, you know, experimental designs and specific parameters for treating something, sensors for like specific observational units, and agents for, I don't know, hypotheses or some sort of conditions of a theory that define what is the parameter you're going to put on that experiment, right? And it's nice because in one of the nicest things about the text, one of those texts on the experiments, is that the author tries to spell out more clearly the condition for an experiment to compose with other experiments, and meaning it needs to be connective with other things, right? So it's not enough for you to get a hypothesis confirmed locally. The confirmation needs to come in such a way that it can be composed with information extracted from some other experiments of a similar type. So they also need to define this idea of a type of experiment that is connected with a hypothesis from a theory. So there is something about how you compose, right, the experiment type, and the sort of information you can gather, and the condition that this information is actually connected with other experiments elsewhere. So that gives that idea of composing different systems where the agents are not necessarily identical, but something about the strategies are cohesive. It gives another kind of nudge in that direction, I think.
Yeah, I think it fits the triad of composition, interaction, and information, right?
Exactly. This is the best stuff I found thus far that kind of gives a bit of flesh to this idea, you know, like they all touch on the 3 points one way or another, giving more emphasis to one of them. They share some technical means, right? And they're all either directly related to topics we talked about. I mean, categorical cybernetics is like just another name for technology. I mean, they do a very similar thing. Like if cybernetics was concerned with how organizing stuff is a condition for things to be controllable or not in certain ways or not, it would just be called technology rather than cybernetics, right? So some stuff is very clearly on point. Some stuff is kind of near and seems useful, but it all kind of, I think, does start kind of giving a direction, you know, that we could split these points in separate research points, presentations and discussions that could build up, you know. But I mean, I'll try to go back through these last 3 points here next meeting. Of course, my idea is not to explain the papers, because I still would need to research, and I wanted to share this and see who wants to take up parts of this stuff. But I think we could go over them and have a more specific discussion on some of the, you know, intuitive connections between one thing and other parts of what we've been doing and so on.
Yeah, behavioral analysis for power, or behavioral meteorology for power analysis is really, that's a great connection.
It really tracks, right? It really seems like, and I think it's the closest one. Like if we just look at the sort of
the closest one for giving like the form of how power does what it does, I think.
Yeah, I think so. And I think, I do think it would help with the other stuff, because it's hard to know what experiments in politics do. Like, and I think that it already helps to clarify in a way, right? It is a matter of interacting to see what you're capable of in terms of constraints as well. So it could be a way to clarify the other parts of the research as well.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah, surprisingly, the behavioral meteorology one is perhaps the one we kind of understand the best, even though it's extremely confusing also.
I definitely feel like that, personally.
Yeah, I really want to read the other one too, the resource sharing, because I've been reading this economist, Eleanor Ostrom, and her work is all about common pool resources. So like how to avoid the tragedy of the commons problem. And I feel like just from the name, resource sharing machines would be important there.
Yeah, I really think it's really a real pity. And I mean, I think, again, it would be nice just to look for material. Like, for now, honestly, the closest thing I think we ever found, I didn't add it here, but the two closest things I've ever found people discussing how composition structures informational space is from integrated information theory, which has a kind of constant discussion of partitioning of parts and so on, and looking at probability transition spaces and so on. So it does have that kind of connection in one way or another. And that Robert Rosen guy who actually tries to build a direct theory of organization on top of this. And at some point, I'd like to see if I can bring him into the picture. But it's very hard to find anything that is not a bit too kind of loose and informal on this. Like, you can find, like, there's this guy called Gilbert Simondon. He does talk about how materials kind of get some metastable state, and then this makes them interact with the environment, but it's just like philosophical description. It doesn't allow you to kind of play around and typify this in different ways, and it just tells you that this exists, you know, as philosophers do. And and so it's very hard. I think this resource sharing thing, and this idea that how do you talk about composition, and going all the way, right? It needs to be a bit more for genetic, in the sense that there wasn't an information channel and suddenly there is. But then it also needs to go the other way back, I think. Once you have a certain information channel, it redescribes that material, which I think is the thing you were talking about, the sort of, yes, synaptics, neurons firing up seems to be the basic state unit, but isn't that already a product of also the sort of space that is created by the fact that that unit was chosen? Like, it's hard to navigate that, and there's very little stuff, I think, there. And the experiment thing is the one that since we're not gonna come up with as Yasha said, a specific theory of scientific experiments, we just want that forgetful, abstracted version that we can import into politics. I'm not sure. Perhaps we can find better stuff. There's a lot of stuff on scientific experiments, right? There's this huge bibliography, but it's, from a categorical point of view, I didn't find that much. That's why I ended up reading Sprott's text. Like, I couldn't find that much writing on it. So I don't know, but I do feel like it kind of, even if in the sense that it gives a bit of an image to each one of those 3 points of that kind of general strategy of composition, interaction, even if in that sense it already, I think, helps out, but it would be nice to start finding more concrete kind of conceptual resources we could use. But anyway, I think we can, unless you guys have a specific point, I think we can either way kind of take it up again next week.
Yeah, next time let's talk more about it. I think I think we're just lacking some examples maybe of, or at least some way we can, like, I guess I have a hard time knowing what to look for right now in terms of other literature that would fit these things, because it's like really brand new, right? So
yeah, it's really hard. I don't know. I honestly, I think that the point 3 here, the one on the resource sharing, is the one that it's the hardest to unpack, because there's one text doing this. Usually it's the stuff I've read on the topic is usually very philosophical, pointing out that this is a big problem, and it's sometimes treated as an untreatable problem, right? Because it requires, like, how does one level appear from another? It looks like this sort of reductionist theoretical project, right? How does information spring from physics or things like this? And it can become like, just go to another direction, which I don't think is what we're looking for. We're not asking like the original question of how information arose from language, arose from a world without language, or something like a big rupture. We're just looking for how things that don't make a difference can start making a difference, right? Badiou has a lot on that already. So it's not like we need to reinvent the wheel to connect it. It's just that on the one hand, we don't start like Badiou from this very, 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 very abstract idea of a world. We're starting from the social world with different types of constraints that form specific objects, right? And we wanted to introduce new constraints, right? Pretty much, I think that's what it's becoming, right? Things like Badiou's favorite example of Spartacus saying the slaves can go home. That's a new constraint on actions that's coming into the space, and then you start composing other parts of the world based on those new propositions, right?
There also seems to be like a weird kind of duality between constraints and resources, right? I mean, isn't every resource also a constraint?
Yeah, exactly.
Right.
I mean, very broadly, like the obvious example for this is climate change, where taking into consideration natural resources, it seems like some constraints should be placed on social interaction, like recycling and carbon emissions and fossil fuel use and things like this, right? But I think that what we are saying, without really knowing very well, but I think a consequence of what we're saying is that you cannot, it's different to add a new content to an old constraint, meaning, for example, the state is going to pass a law that prohibits fossil fuel, right? That's not really a new form of constraint entering the picture. It's just the law. It's an old constraint. Just the content of it concerns natural resources. It's just that. It's different from natural resources actually making a difference, right? It's not like the same thing. So, for example, we were talking about this. It's different from somebody preventing some farmer from doing something, from the farmer not doing that thing because this way there is a larger, higher chance that his farm will last for longer, right? One thing is a content, don't do this. The other thing is because it actually makes a difference as such. So
yeah, in that sense, laws are kind of a proxy constraint. It's not the actual, it's like the state has to step in when constraints are not propagatable. Like they do not propagate from one interface to another.
yeah, exactly.
Like I, as an individual, I don't sense climate change. So you need to put a law to force me to, I don't know, recycle or whatever.
Yeah, exactly.
So the constraint never reaches me.
Yeah, on the other hand, if you were actually part of an object that includes you and some farmers in South Africa, where the temperature is actually starting to make a difference, if like there were any meaningful connection between you and those people, you might actually sense climate change, right? Not you as a person, but that object would sense it, right? Something would appear, some constraint would appear, and the only answer to it would be climate change, right?
Yeah. I feel like, there's some examples there of like, you have like relatives maybe in a foreign country, they are going through something. So you can now sense it more because you have some connection with that place, right?
Yeah, I think it's, again, it always goes back to that idea that depending on how objects are composed, some differences make a difference. And I think it's clearer that we're not talking about neither theory nor ethics, right? It's not a matter of it should matter in the sense that I could live without it mattering, but I'm choosing to because of some principle, nor a theoretical concern that I believe that this and this is the case, right? It's more on the side of sensitivity. Again, it's aesthetic in the Kantian sense, like the problem of sensibility, right? It's not a problem of intellectual awareness. I think this is ultimately the meaning of this phenomenological thing, right? It's not phenomenology in the sense of how you intellectually construct something, but how it is transcendentally constituted as an object of sensibility, right? That's the point. How do you give space and time, for example, to climate change? From our perspective, which is actually very pessimistic, even though I think it adds something, it's pessimistic because it suggests that climate change will only be a sensible kind of thing you can interact with if you have an object that is made of a certain form, which capitalist societies probably already prevent from existing. So either you
probably like our food supply. It's like, or something like that will be catastrophic in its consequences. That's the only thing that has the scale of the climate, right?
Yeah, but that's the weird thing, like refugee crisis, food crisis. Once you start looking again in terms of the ways these different layers interact, it's very likely that the community layer will project this huge scale of natural catastrophe back on communities, and you won't experience immigrants trying to enter your country as effects of climate change. You will experience as a community interacting with another, right? So and our supply chains, which have all these little kind of hubs in between to eliminate the propagation of risk, right? Because Nike doesn't want to have the risk of having sweatshops in India, and what happens there affects it here. So it's full of kind of safe guards against propagation. So even if your food supply gets totally fucked to the point that you're able to sense that this is connected with the totality, of an ecological catastrophe, and not with some invisible part of the supply chain, it's a gamble, right?
Yeah. The fake news and pandemic are a good example. Like,
yeah, I think it's also good examples.
Yeah, like you can't really tell.
Right. It's nice to think in those terms as well,
Mm-hmm.
Once you have a totally homogeneous scientific community, I mean, it's an ideological kind of blind spot to think that this community is heterogeneous enough that what it can sense, the world should be able to sense. It's not true. It's very homogeneous, very neatly tied together, So I think it does offer a really different way to think about things that are things that are concerned usually resources, but these resources never get to make a difference as such, right? And you get this sort of social structure that mediates the propagation of constraints because the resources themselves are not kind of informative, right? You can't really interact with them directly somehow.
Yeah, it's really clear. I mean, relatively, but it's
for the level of craziness we're talking about, it's weirdly clear.
Yeah, there's something there. I think that.
Yeah, I'm happy with that statement. I think that already I'll already be able to sleep at night with that.
That was very good. That's very interesting. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks for presenting.
Yeah, I mean, next week, I mean, you guys, I sent you the link with all the papers. If you have a chance to just scroll through the stuff, perhaps we can start looking at it with a more clear sense. I really want to see, go back to these taxon experiments and see if I can understand what the hell they are talking about. There are two things I didn't add that I wanted to add, but it would be just too much, and I think that they can appear separately. One is the thing Renzo mentioned, which is this Robert Rosen's theory on organization. It has a nice link with this reparameterizable optics, because he developed this theory of anticipatory systems, which was his kind of proto-model for living things, living organisms. And it has a very interesting kind of structure of interacting with the environment, but also saving its own, like you need to produce the codomain of a function and reproduce the function of that system that kind of has a system. So it has a kind of repair function inside of it. I wonder if it couldn't kind of be treated in similar terms as this thing, but it has the added thing, which is that Rosen was probably the biologist who was the most kind of interested in how materials can become organizations where the units are not states, but what he called components, which are just functionally defined by organizations themselves. So it has that nice kind of connection between the material composition and the information and so on. So that's one thing. And the other thing that I think could easily be added to this list of things is this work by this famous logician called John Barwise. In the 90s, he worked on something called surrogate reasoning, which is a theory of how you delegate. It's like one of the first, now there are many papers on this, but first papers on how certain problems are better solved by moving them to a material substrate. whose inner logic is better equipped to answering the problem than, let's say, your head, right? And I think it also connects very nicely with the stuff on experiments and so on. So I think those are two things. If I have time, I'll just add them to the list. But otherwise, there's already a lot to go over, I guess.
Yeah, try to take a look.
Great,
I mean,
guys.
the document looks like a long calendar. Like if we want to study it, it can definitely make into like an agenda for.
Yeah, that's what I was thinking. I mean, I was trying to see if people wouldn't find like interesting parts of this, that we could kind of dismember this idea into presentations everyone could work on, you know. And some of the stuff, like the experiment stuff, especially one of the texts, is very introductory. So people who want to learn more about like category theory and so on would probably focus on that, you know, because it's more accessible, things like this. So people interested in, you know, machine learning data could focus on things that connect with that. So, you know, yeah. Anyway,
Yeah,
I'll
I'm down to divide and organize this.
that would be cool. I'll ask people in the group if they're you need to take up some parts of this.
Yeah,
Yeah, great idea.
Great, guys.
okay.
Have a good week. Take care.
The shortest meeting we've ever had.
Yeah, by like half the time.
Yes. See ya.
Bye.
See you guys.
Bye.
Bye bye.